You and I have talked quite a bit about the Online Safety Act and the Data Protection Act. I know you've had various conversations, Paul, in various contexts about these, and our audience will have different levels of knowledge on what these things are. Probably one of the years that digital identity has been in the press the most, and it's been really come to the forefront of our cultural knowledge, but people are peripherally aware of these things, not specifically what each act and each regulation relates to. So I guess it's probably a good start to ask, how do these things bump up against each other? What are these two things, the Online Safety Act and the Data Protection Act, and how do they collide?
So I think it's a really good question, and it's one that we've been asked quite a few times in relation to where these various bits of legislation conflict. I mean, from my perspective, the Online Safety Act is the principles that it sets are a really good thing. It's about protecting individuals' information and data, particularly, topics which touch things like child safety, the content that could otherwise be used in a manner which would be bad for individuals, for communities, and those sorts of things. And it sort of requires that companies, therefore, are able to police activity and information, which in itself is a really good principle. The problem is, and I guess where this bumps up against the other issues, is that the other ICO and GDPR-esque legislation is there to ensure that online activity remains safeguarded and invisible. And therefore, the two subjects conflict, i.e., one requires data to be quite open to ensure that it can be policed. The other respects the fact that we all live online these days in a world where our banking apps and the web experiences we have include very personal and sensitive data. So, of course, none of us want that data to be out there in the wild and for people to be able to see it. But that there in itself is the conflict. That's where, we're seeing some friction between two acts which equally serve to achieve the right outputs, but in themselves set out a set of standards and behaviors that conflict. I mean, a good example, by the way, is, if you've got to log every user interaction for audit trails to be in sync with legislation, and this is something that is there to satisfy the ICO and people like Ofcom, that then starts to conflict with how much of my data is out there in the wild.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. So when it comes to organizations, it's really the concept of data minimization, not holding, asking for too much data on your customers, on your users, but also making sure that you ask for, potentially hold enough information to be able to know who they are and that you're dealing with the right person. And perhaps things like, they're not on sanctions lists or any of the things that regulated companies might need to do for things like anti-money laundering processes. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the legislation already makes it clear that you can't simply start to harvest and accrue lots of information about someone if it's not for good reason, for a valid and verifiable reason. So it's already a challenge for businesses to ensure that they're being appropriate in what data they use. The word harvest, but that's probably not a wrong word to use in some cases, because people don't like the idea of big organizations amassing information about them that they don't necessarily need. So the legislation already compels that we are respectful of collecting and maintaining the right data for the right and for a consented or permissioned activity, as it were.
Is that the key then? It's proportionality. It's making sure that we're collecting data for the right reasons, and we've only got data for the right reasons. I think where people most have seen this online in their own experience this year will be age assurance journeys. All of a sudden, you might be trying to access content and you're being asked to verify your age. That's a very good example where you're being asked to give some information to a site or a provider or a supplier that you might not really trust. You might not know whether you should be giving that information. How do you approach that as a company, as an organization, wanting to make sure that you're abiding by this age assurance regulation, but also that you're maintaining user trust.
So for me, this is all about balance. Age verification is a really important facet of the Online Safety Act. There's a lot of activity, a lot of narrative online. You'll see, as you've already mentioned, Sam, around identity verification and within that age verification. But I guess what this needs to take into account is those data minimization principles that are under UK's GDPR, i.e., again, what are you doing? What data do you need to perform the function you're performing? It's a topic close to our hearts, Sam, because obviously when we set this business up, one of our ambitions in empowering consumers and businesses was how they can use their own networks, their own connectivity as a means of starting to assert identity, improve who they are, prove their age even possibly, but without having to move possibly to the extent of a national identity, because there's some real interesting dilemmas and some interesting challenges that are presented. People are in some cases uncomfortable with subscribing to the idea of a national identity. So I guess the question is, well, if I don't want to go that far, how can I meet the needs of a site that may need to know that I'm 18 or over, to be legal in terms of its functions to me, without going to the lengths of a full IDMV sort of checks. Privacy preserving methods, are of meeting those requirements are becoming more and more important, and it's an area within our Assure Score future that we believe we've got something interesting that's in that space.
Can you talk a little bit about that approach of being a bit more, words like contextual, dynamic in collecting data about users or customers? Because if I'm a financial advisor and I'm a small business and I'm dealing one-to-one with people, it would be a very logical thing to think, well, what I should do at the beginning of that relationship is collect all the information I might possibly need on this person at one time, so that I'm not constantly asking them for different bits. There's that approach, and that has been an approach in the past for big businesses as well. And then there's the kind of dynamic, piecemeal, consented, privacy by design, all these terms that we throw out, approach that we're moving towards. Can you sort of sketch that out a bit and why it's better?
Yeah, so I guess in the context of age verification, by way of example, there are tools that will enable you to, say, go through a full high fidelity, verify your passport, selfie scan type tech. And there are applications where that is actually the only way you can get the level of fidelity required in order to fulfill your obligations. If you're, as you mentioned earlier, some of those topics around anti-money laundering or checking that people aren't on PEPs and sanctions lists, you need quite deep data to do that. But in every instance, when someone's trying to consider what it is they are performing as a function for an end consumer, you have to ask yourself the question, is that necessary? Because to achieve the sort of protective aims that again are within the legislation, is it collecting enough information to perform the function, or are you turning into surveillance? And that, but by the same token, if you happen to be party or in the vicinity of someone, undertaking some criminal activity, I suspect the first thing you're going to do is look up and say, was there a camera around that captured that? Because that will help me with my evidence. So all these things, it's horses for courses, isn't it? And sadly, sometimes it's after the fact you find out the camera's a great one, where you needed that extra surveillance in order to help you. So it's a very hot topic, and one which hasn't sort of necessarily yet concluded. We'll see where it lands in the longer term.
I guess a lot of this it's not just companies knowing the regulation, it's as a customer, what should I be giving away? And it's quite specific to each use case. I can be quite aware now as a consumer that I can do a subject access request. I can ask a company what information they hold on me, and I can be quite aware of that right as a consumer. But I might not be aware of the flaws in processes around that companies can have. I might be quite happy to send that subject access request by standard email and receive the response by standard email. So, I'm very aware of my rights in one domain, but not in another.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, and you're right, because it starts to touch on different dynamics. SARS are a really interesting discussion point on this topic, I think, because as a consumer, I'm entitled to request from a company information about me. Of course, if that company wants to be robust in its compliance when it receives those sorts of requests, you might suggest that what it should be doing before it releases what could be very sensitive personal data is making sure I am the person I claim to be, that I am actually able to make that request. An ID&V check, would probably be considered sufficient. But, demanding that someone sends you their passport, for instance, and that world, I hope it ultimately is changing now with the advent of new technologies. People are rightly uncomfortable about sending, precious documents like passports and driving licenses and birth certificates, etc., in the postal service. Although, statistically, you're very likely for that item to arrive, there's still a chance that it won't. And there's still a chance that it might get lost and destroyed. Then you've got to replace it, and you might be going on holiday. There's so many emotions that are wrapped up with that sort of data being shared in the post. And yet people still seem to be okay to make a copy of it and possibly send it an email. In fact, they're encouraged by companies to do that. But it's the old postcard scenario. Would you stick a postcard in the post telling someone about your bank details? Well, of course you wouldn't. An open postcard that anyone could read as it bounces its way from one sorting office to the next. You'd never do that, would you? Well, I hope no one would ever do that. And they're equally sensitive around sending precious, cherished documents. In email, they're doing it every day. Less so, I think, because I hope the message is getting out there. And SARS are a great one, aren't they? Because if you rang me up and did a subject access request, Sam, and I checked you were the Sam you claim to be, then the next thing is, well, I've now got a load of sensitive data that I need to get to you and to only you. And I need to, from a compliance perspective, make sure that when I send it to you, by whatever means, that only you can see it. Therein lies the dilemma. It's both ends of the dynamics of verifying the integrity of the individual's request, and then how you satisfy that request in a way that doesn't contravene legislation itself. And that's the piece where I think, we've definitely focused on from a Malloc perspective to try and address all those, alongside some functionality you'll see introduced in coming weeks to help take that even further.
Yeah, we've talked for a long time about the importance of being able to verify who you're talking to over what we might call standard communication channels, commonly used communication channels like email. We've also talked for a long time about how a lot of companies who are responsible have obligations to their customers in this regard just aren't really aware, or a lot of people within these companies aren't really aware that they should be doing that. I'm interested because you speak to a lot of these companies, especially the larger ones, and we've had this real, this kind of prevalence last year of Digital Identity Online Safety Act, all this stuff sort of bubbling to the forefront of the national culture. Do you think that people are more aware that they should be securing this kind of information now?
I think that landscape is getting better. I think we've got a lot more work to do to help people understand the digital world, and try and lay up comparisons. I hope these sort of sessions help bring that to life for people so that they can understand the analog equivalent, really. So, again, going slightly back to that topic before, I really hope if people are ever called to send cherished documents, passports to someone, the first thing they will do is they'll probably elect to pay a higher premium for recorded delivery, because they want to make sure it gets there. They want to know where it is in its transit. They want to know it's arrived. What you want to do is you want to know it's arrived, and the obligation for its safety is now in someone else's hands, including to get back to you. That's what you would do, wouldn't you? And it's the same, in fact, in other worlds when the advisors are trying to advise customers, they need information about their policies, and it's the same with letters of authority and all that stuff. It's really important stuff. And yet, in email, our equivalent, which is Malloc really, is digital recorded delivery. How do you exercise the same checks and balances digitally to ensure that someone can't intercept that data? But not just that, they make sure that it's only falling into the right hands, an audit trail of its delivery. All that stuff is exactly what we've been trying to aim to do here to solve some of those problems. And they're not just about, SARS, letters of authority. They're about everyday activity. Our data is precious, and I really hope people are beginning to understand in an increasingly digital world how important it is to put our arms around it our data and protect it.
I think it's important to stop in these moments and recognize that there are still so many people who might be aware that they should be securing information, that they'll be aware that a piece of information they're sending is sensitive. They might not necessarily be aware that their corporate infrastructure that they're using email on isn't all secured for them. So I think it is important to keep breaking it down to the simple fact of, why is open email not secure? Why is it like a postcard? I know we've talked about this a lot of times, but just to go back to the basics of that, why is it not secure? Why is that not secure? Even if my IT admin has installed my email client and set up the email provider.
I think I'm going to use someone else's explanation to me some time ago, which I won't lay claim to, but the similes between the postal service and the internet are actually quite amazing. The internet is a woven together collection, huge network of interconnected computers and servers and systems. And sometimes the links between those servers and computers and systems are secure, but it's what they call opportunistic. Sometimes they're not. And when you send an email, by way of example, in the same way as when you send a piece of post, that letter, when you pop it in the post box, doesn't just get picked up by somebody who then drives it to your destination. The economics of scale require them to go through sorting offices. And we're not trying to teach people to suck eggs here, but they centralize everything. They make sure that when ultimately the van that goes into the area that is yours, Sam, is carrying a load of other stuff that's for the same area. So the economies of scale for delivery in your neighborhood makes sense. So it goes to possibly one or more than one sorting office. It bounces from one location to the other and on it goes. The logistics are pretty amazing. So sometimes, we have to bear that in mind when there are criticisms of the Royal Mail. It's a British institution that has served us really well, but it's dated. The internet's no different. Those sorting offices you can replace for these big servers and the different email infrastructures. Your email doesn't go direct from your desktop, sadly, straight to the desktop of your target. It will bounce off of different computers and servers. And at each bounce, it is readable. It's effectively repeated, like a little repeater system that bounces onto that. And there it arrives magically on your inbox, and fabulous. You'd never known it. It's been through all those different pipes, but it has, and it's open. And therefore, if someone decides to, and they do, at industrial scale, read it, they can. Like my postcard scenario before. If you put a postcard in the post with something sensitive in it, then the guy who's sorting it isn't just going to read the address. They get the ability to read the second side. So when you start to sort of make some comparisons about the physical and the digital world, I think it really brings to life why these topics are so important. Indeed, it brings to life why it's not just about one message. These organizations that are surveilling our data are also really sophisticated capabilities. They're joining bits of data. So what you might think is the most innocuous piece of information that shouldn't really lead to any fraud, connect it with a few other bits of data, and suddenly you've got enough to represent yourself as someone you're not. And that's what's going on. I think it's really, really important. Again, I'm going to use that, put our arms around our data, just make sure our habits that we form are conducive with how important our personas are, our information is, because if you do so, hopefully you won't fall foul of those that want to use your data for dubious means.
As you were saying that, I was thinking, I watched something the other day about how the sorting office is mainly automated these days. So the man now sorting your postcard is not a man. It's probably most of the time a little robot. And increasingly, there'll be more little robots wandering around the street, possibly delivering your letters. So
yeah, probably.
Possibly even more than 10 years ago when you first were talking about that analogy, the digital and the analog. The analog's way less digital now, and there's probably much more parity between those data packets that are envelopes and data packets that are emails than there ever was.
100%. And we have to also be careful. I mean, we work with the most prevalent companies that perform the print functions for large organizations, because, if you're a big insurer or a wealth manager or a bank, you don't have a printer running in your back office sending stuff off. You use other parties that specialize, as you absolutely should. Economies of scale and expertise and all that stuff come to bear. But I was reminded the other day that whilst that still lives there and there are billions and billions of letters sent, ultimately they're generated out of digital content. Again, the digital world is powering the analog world, even if in the background you don't see it. So your example is a fabulous one.
If you were to leave Elon Musk's robots and Jeff Bezos is delivering drones in the future for now, because I think we could probably talk about that for a while as well. If you're advising a leadership team at a company today, having heard this conversation, we brought up a lot of stuff: identity checks, data minimization, regulation, retention practices, securing data in transit. Where would you start? How would you prioritize? How would you not be overwhelmed?
So I think there are a lot of different areas that businesses and business execs, leaders need to consider. Training always comes into it. Make sure your team understand these dynamics. If they have a better understanding, they'll be able to better advise you, enable you, lift out of the weeds the topics that you need to consider about. I think I'd be saying, look, use adequate verification processes around identity and authentication and consent. These things are important. Know your customers is what's used in advisor and accountancy and legal world. For us, it's understanding our customers and what we're performing as a function for them, and therefore what data is required. So that then helps you understand your data minimization strategy. Be tight around that. Don't also be rigorous about the retention schedules. Ensure that you are reviewing this position on an ongoing basis. And certainly from a point of view of course, email and other processes, don't leave a back door open. You might be being very diligent about how your business operates, and then through no disrespect, possibly ignorance, or not have quite realised that at the very last moment, that last step, you failed to close the door on a risk, which is, reputationally would be a disaster for anybody. Let alone the legal ramifications and the fines and things. This is about your customers wanting to continue to deal with you. If I had a business that had not been adequately protecting my valuable assets, my data, and fell foul, I'd definitely think twice about whether I'm using them. So, just make sure you're thinking about this now and have a plan, and that you continue to review that plan. It should be part of your risk register. It should be part of your operations manual. It should be part of, your customer engagement discussion. So a lot to think about. Definitely
a lot to think about. I think we talk about the risks a lot and the complexities of this topic or these topics. It's good to end on a positive note of there are lots of solutions coming out. There are lots of people working on these problems. What are you most excited about in identity and how we verify each other are the right people, how we communicate within the next couple of years, few years? I think technology has made some big leaps around this, and I'm not going to leap on the AI bandwagon here, because I think, actually a lot of these discussions and a lot of the solutions have been in build or evolving around us, and they've matured to a level now where, some of those more lumpy, bumpy journeys that we became almost used to verify we are indeed who we claim to be, have improved significantly, to the extent that you're going to see them out in the wilds and economically more accessible. The commercial model around using that tech is going to take a leap in the right direction. So I think that's great news. I also think that data for good is a really powerful thing. When we talk about the Assure Score piece, and generally not trying to do a product flog here, but at the very beginning of that journey, we were trying to think how people's data, the connectivity, their crowd that's already authenticated them, again, that crowd authentication piece we use, that's a really valuable asset that a consumer can use to their advantage to save them having to be oversharing, should we say, around data that might otherwise be used, to help address some of the problems we talked about there, Sam. So for me, we happen to be in a place where this is starting to now become real. So I'm really excited about life becoming a bit easier, a bit safer, and therefore the digital world being somewhat better for some of the evolution and maturity of some of these technologies. We've covered a lot today, and there's a lot to be covered. Like you say, it's an exciting time. Good to chat on a Friday, and we'll speak soon. Cheers, mate.